If the call comes from the old mill, don't respond alone. The words were my introduction to Greywater Hollow, scribbled on the back of the station rulebook in faded black ink. I could still hear Lisa Briggs's voice as she said it, the weight behind the words giving them an edge I couldn't ignore. I wasn't sure if she was serious or playing some kind of elaborate small-town hazing ritual on the new guy, but the look in her eyes suggested the former. "It's not a joke, Nate," Lisa said, leaning against the EMS station's chipped counter as she stirred creamer into her coffee. "If the mill calls in, don't go alone. Hell, if you can avoid it, don't go at all." Her warning lingered as I looked around the station. It was a small place, nestled on the edge of town near the main road. Just 2 ambulances sat outside, battered but functional. The walls of the break room were cluttered with fading pictures of the town's founding and yellowing certificates. Everything about the place felt weathered, like the town itself. Greywater Hollow was supposed to be my fresh start. After 5 years in the city, after the incident I refused to think about, I had been craving somewhere quieter. Somewhere slower. Somewhere I wouldn't be haunted by sirens and guilt every time I closed my eyes. But something about this town already felt off. Lisa handed me the official Greywater EMS rulebook, a small, battered binder. "Read it," she said. "And take it seriously." I flipped through it as she spoke, skimming through the basics. Most of it was standard protocol for a paramedic: maintain safety, assess the scene, prioritize life-saving measures. But halfway through, the tone of the rules shifted. The next few lines were written in a cramped, rushed handwriting, completely different from the rest of the manual. Rule number 1, don't respond to calls from the old mill alone. Rule number 2, always leave an offering if a call leads to the swamp. Rule number 3, if someone on a call mentions the Watcher, leave immediately. I looked up at Lisa, raising an eyebrow. Seriously? The Watcher? Offerings? What is this, some kind of Halloween prank? Her face didn't change. If anything, it grew more serious. You don't have to believe it, Nate. But you need to follow the rules. People who don't, well, let's just say they don't last long around here. There was no humor in her voice, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of unease. People who don't last long? I asked. Lisa shrugged and took a sip of her coffee. A few burned out. Couldn't handle the work. A couple just didn't come back from calls. She let the words hang in the air like smoke. Over the next few days, I got to know the town. It wasn't what I expected. I'd come here hoping for a sleepy little hamlet where time moved slowly and life was uncomplicated. But Greywater Hollow had a weight to it, like the town itself was holding its breath. The streets were quiet, even in the middle of the day. The houses were old, their paint peeling, their shutters clinging to cracked windows. The people were friendly enough, but there was an undercurrent to their smiles, something tight and cautious, like they were trying not to say too much. And then there was the old mill. I hadn't been out there yet, just the sight of it in the distance was enough to send a shiver down my spine. The mill sat at the edge of the swamp, its skeletal remains rising out of the fog like a jagged tooth. Its rotted wood and leaning smokestack told the story of a structure long past its prime. Every time I asked someone about it, they changed the subject. "You don't need to worry about the mill," Lisa told me one evening. "Just remember the rules. And if a call ever comes from there, let me handle it." I had only been on the job for 3 days when my first shift with Lisa got interesting. The radio crackled to life just after sunset, interrupting the quiet hum of the station. Unit 2, respond to a possible injury, coordinates near the old mill. The words sent a chill down my spine, though I wasn't sure why. I glanced at Lisa, expecting her to groan or roll her eyes, but instead, she froze. Her hand hovered over her coffee mug, and her expression turned grim. "We're not taking that call," she said flatly. "Not taking it? Isn't that kind of against the whole help people thing?" I asked, half joking to ease the tension. Lisa didn't smile. "We're not going, Nate." But before I could respond, the radio crackled again. Unit 2, confirm receipt. Priority 1. Caller reports a possible head injury. Lisa cursed under her breath and grabbed the keys to the ambulance. Fine. But you're sticking close, got it? I nodded, grabbing my gear and following her outside. The ride out to the old mill was unsettling. The narrow road twisted through the dense forest, the headlights barely piercing the thick fog that clung to the trees. The swamp seemed to creep closer with every mile, the gnarled roots and moss-covered branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I glanced at Lisa, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. So, what exactly am I supposed to be watching out for? I asked, trying to sound casual. Just stay alert, she said. And whatever you do, don't go wandering off. Not even a step. Wandering off where? She didn't answer. The headlights cut through the fog as we approached the old mill, but it felt like they weren't doing much. The dense mist clung to the trees and the broken-down path like it was alive, wrapping the road in a shroud of gray. Slow down, I said instinctively, leaning forward to peer out the windshield. Lisa didn't answer. Her knuckles were white against the steering wheel, her jaw clenched. She was tense, hyper-focused. We rounded a bend, and there it was, the old mill. The structure loomed out of the fog, its silhouette jagged and uneven against the faint glow of the moon. Its walls were a patchwork of rotting wood and rusted metal, and its roof sagged in places, the old smokestack leaning at a precarious angle. Around the mill, the swamp pressed close, its dark waters rippling in the faint breeze. The radio crackled again, the dispatcher's voice distorted by static. Unit 2, you've arrived on scene. Please advise on patient condition. We're here, Lisa muttered, but she didn't reach for the radio. Instead, she grabbed her flashlight and nodded toward the back of the ambulance. Grab the kit. We'll move together. I hesitated. You okay? Just stay close, Nate, she said, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. We stepped out of the ambulance, the swampy air thick and heavy around us. The smell of stagnant water and decay was overwhelming, and every step squelched against the muddy ground. Hello? Lisa called out, her voice firm but cautious. EMS. Is anyone there? For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the dead trees and the distant creak of the mill structure. Then, from somewhere near the edge of the swamp, we heard it, a low, pained groan. This way, I said, leading the way with my flashlight. The beam of light landed on a figure slumped against the base of a tree. It was a man, middle-aged, his clothes tattered and caked with mud. He looked up as we approached, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and glassy. Hey there, I said, kneeling beside him. I'm Nate, a paramedic. Can you tell me what happened? The man's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I didn't bring anything. I glanced at Lisa, who had gone rigid. What do you mean? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Are you hurt? Can you tell me where you're injured? The man grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. It's coming, he rasped. It doesn't like it when you come empty-handed. What's coming? I asked, but before he could answer, a loud splash came from the swamp behind him. I turned, my flashlight sweeping over the dark waters. At first, there was nothing, just rippling reflections of dead trees in the stagnant water. But then, I saw it. Something moved through the fog, just beyond the edge of the light. It was low to the ground, crawling, its shape indistinct but wrong. The fog seemed to thicken around it, as if shielding it from view. Nate, Lisa said sharply. We need to go. I glanced back at her. What? We can't leave him here. The man groaned again, louder this time, and then suddenly pushed himself to his feet. He was trembling, swaying unsteadily, but there was a wild, frantic look in his eyes. It's too late, he said, his voice cracking. It's already here. Before either of us could react, he turned and bolted toward the swamp, his movements erratic and desperate. "Wait!" I shouted, running after him, but Lisa grabbed my arm. "Don't," she said, her voice low and firm. "We're leaving. Now." "But we can't help him." "Not here." Something in her tone stopped me. It wasn't fear, it was certainty. She yanked me back toward the ambulance, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she moved. We didn't stop moving until we were back inside the ambulance with the doors locked. Lisa was breathing hard, her eyes fixed on the mill as if expecting something to emerge from the fog. "What the hell just happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We're supposed to help people, Lisa." "That man is gone," she interrupted, her tone cold. "And if we'd stayed, we would be too." I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "What was out there? What did you see?" "It doesn't matter," she said. "What matters is we're alive." The radio crackled again, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the silence. "Unit 2, please confirm patient status." Lisa picked up the receiver. Patient was gone upon arrival. No injuries to report. Returning to station. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something about the way she gripped the radio, the way her hand trembled ever so slightly, stopped me. The drive back to the station was tense. I stared out the window, my thoughts racing. The man's words echoed in my mind. I didn't bring anything. What had he meant by that? And what had I seen in the swamp? By the time we got back, Lisa's usual sharpness had returned. She parked the ambulance and turned to me. "Listen, Nate. I get that you're new here, and you want to understand everything. But some things in this town, you're better off not knowing." "That's not good enough," I said. "What was out there? And why the hell does this town have rules about stuff like this?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's complicated. And it's not my job to explain it to you." "Whose job is it then?" She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her things and walked into the station, leaving me alone in the dark. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay on the thin mattress in my room above the station, staring at the cracks in the ceiling as the events of the night replayed in my mind. The man's wild eyes, his cryptic warning, and the thing I'd glimpsed in the swamp, it all gnawed at me, refusing to let me rest. Lisa's silence was worse. She hadn't said another word to me after we returned, her face locked in an expression of grim determination. I wanted to ask her more, to demand answers, but I knew she wouldn't give them. Instead, I turned to the rulebook. I flipped through the pages again, my flashlight illuminating the handwritten additions that had first caught my attention. The rules felt different now, less like a joke and more like a warning. Rule number 1, don't respond to calls from the old mill alone. Rule number 2, always leave an offering if a call leads to the swamp. Rule number 3, if someone on a call mentions the Watcher, leave immediately. The Watcher. That name sent a shiver down my spine. The man by the swamp had been delirious, but he'd said something about it. Had I heard it wrong? Or had Lisa ignored it on purpose? I closed the rulebook and sat up, my resolve hardening. If Lisa wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. The next morning, I walked to Greywater Hollow's tiny library. It was a cramped, dusty place, its shelves filled with old, water-stained books and town records. The librarian, a thin, nervous man named Carl, gave me a curious look as I approached. "Looking for something specific?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "I need information about the old mill. Accidents, disappearances, anything like that." Carl's face darkened. "Why would you want to dig into that?" "Curiosity," I said, forcing a smile. He hesitated, then gestured toward a corner of the library. "Records are over there. But don't say I didn't warn you." I spent hours combing through the records. At first, it was just old newspaper clippings, reports of minor injuries and occasional disputes among the mill workers. But as I dug deeper, the stories took a darker turn. There were articles about strange accidents, workers disappearing, machines turning on by themselves, and several incidents of people claiming to see things in the fog. One headline caught my eye. Foreman found dead near mill, locals blame the watcher. The article was dated over a century ago, but the description of the foreman's death was chilling. His body had been found near the swamp, his face twisted in terror, his skin pale and cold. Witnesses claimed to have heard whispers in the fog that night, though no one could explain where they came from. As I read on, I began to notice a pattern. Every few decades, there was a spike in disappearances and unexplained deaths around the mill. And in almost every case, the survivors mentioned the watcher. 2 nights later, the radio crackled to life. Unit 2, respond to an unknown disturbance. Location, Old Mill. Caller disconnected. I froze, the memories of my first trip to the mill flooding back. My eyes darted to Lisa, but she wasn't there. She had taken the night off, leaving me alone with the on-call EMT, Darren, a rookie even greener than me. "You taking it?" Darren asked, his voice uncertain. I hesitated, Lisa's warning echoing in my mind. But my curiosity burned hotter than my fear. I needed to know what was happening at the mill. "Yeah," I said finally. "I'll take it. Stay here and keep the radio on." "You sure?" Darren asked. "Positive." I grabbed my kit and headed out. The drive to the mill felt longer this time. The fog was heavier than before, clinging to the road like a living thing. I kept the windows up and the radio off, the silence in the ambulance oppressive. When I arrived, the mill looked worse than I remembered. The moonlight barely pierced the fog, casting faint shadows across the crumbling structure. The swamp was still, its waters black and impenetrable. I stepped out of the ambulance, my flashlight cutting through the dark. "Hello?" I called out. "EMS. Is anyone here?" At first, there was no response. But then, from the edge of the swamp, I heard it, a soft, muffled sob. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight landing on a small figure crouched near the water. It was a boy, no older than 10, his face streaked with tears. "Hey," I said, approaching cautiously. "Are you hurt?" The boy looked up, his eyes wide and glassy. "My brother," he said, his voice trembling. "He's in there. Please help him." He pointed toward the mill. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the boy's face, pale, frightened, kept me rooted in place. "Wait here," I said. "I'll go find him." The boy nodded but didn't say anything else. The air grew colder as I approached the mill, each step heavier than the last. The wooden door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing the dark interior. The mill smelled of damp wood and decay, the walls covered in moss and cobwebs. My flashlight cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone here?" No response. As I moved deeper into the mill, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in white puffs, and the beam of my flashlight flickered. That's when I heard it. Whispers. Soft and faint, coming from the shadows. They didn't form words, but their tone was urgent, almost pleading. I stopped, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I said again, my voice shaking. The whispers stopped. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the mill, and I spun around, my flashlight landing on a pile of debris that had fallen from the rafters. My pulse raced as I scanned the room, looking for any sign of the boy's brother. But there was nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I made my way back to the entrance. The whispers had followed me the entire time, growing louder the closer I got to the door. When I stepped outside, the boy was gone. "Kid?" I called out, my voice cutting through the fog. "Where are you?" The only response was the rustling of the trees and the distant croak of a bullfrog. I searched the area for nearly an hour, but there was no trace of him. No footprints, no signs of movement, nothing. It was as if he had never been there at all. When I finally returned to the ambulance, my hands were trembling. My flashlight felt heavy in my grip, the weight of the night pressing down on me. I didn't tell Darren what had happened when I got back to the station. I didn't tell anyone. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake. The boy's face haunted me, his wide, glassy eyes staring back at me every time I closed my own. And somewhere, in the distance, I swore I could hear whispers. The next morning, I found Lisa in the break room, sipping her coffee like nothing had happened. "Morning," she said without looking up. "Don't morning me," I snapped, slamming the station's rulebook onto the counter. "I went out to the mill last night. Alone." Her hand froze mid-sip, and her eyes narrowed. "You what?" "I took a call. There was a boy crying by the swamp. He said his brother was inside." My voice rose as I spoke, the frustration spilling out. "I didn't see anyone else, and by the time I came back, the kid was gone." "You idiot," she muttered, standing abruptly. Her coffee cup rattled on the counter as she leaned toward me. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I followed the rules as best I could," I shot back. "But I'm done playing along with these stupid superstitions. I need to know what's really going on out there." Lisa stared at me for a long moment, her jaw clenched. Then she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Fine. You want to know? I'll tell you. But you're not going to like it." We sat in the station's tiny office, the blinds drawn and the door locked. Lisa pulled out a battered folder from a drawer and dropped it onto the desk. Inside were faded photographs, handwritten notes, and yellowing clippings from old newspapers. "This town has been cursed since before you or I were born," she began. "And it all goes back to that damn mill." She explained that the old mill had been the heart of Greywater Hollow's economy in the late 1800s, providing jobs for almost everyone in town. But in 1893, something changed. Rumor has it, the mill's foreman, Jeremiah Harker, wasn't satisfied with what he had, Lisa said. He wanted more. More money, more power, more everything. And he was willing to do anything to get it. Harker, she explained, had dabbled in the occult. Late one night, he performed a ritual in the mill's main chamber, hoping to summon a supernatural entity to grant him wealth and influence. But the ritual didn't work the way he thought it would, Lisa said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Instead of granting him power, it summoned something else. She pulled out a photograph of the mill taken shortly after the incident. Even in black and white, the building seemed wrong, its shadows too deep and its angles unnatural. "The Watcher," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "That's what people started calling it. No one knows exactly what it is, but it's been tied to the mill ever since. And every few decades, it takes someone." I frowned, struggling to process what she was saying. "Take someone? What do you mean?" Lisa hesitated, then gestured to the rulebook I'd slammed on the counter. "The rules aren't there to scare you, Nate. They're there to protect you. The Watcher feeds on people who break them." She explained that the entity Harker summoned was a predator, drawn to fear and desperation. It lured people into the mill with illusions and whispers, feeding on their life force once they were inside. "That's why you're never supposed to go alone," Lisa said. "It's easier to prey on a single person. And if you don't bring an offering." "What kind of offering?" I interrupted. "Anything," she said. "Coins, food, even a flower. Just something to show respect." Harker didn't offer anything during the ritual, and that's what bound the Watcher to this place. Now, it demands tribute. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the boy's face staring back at me, his wide, glassy eyes filled with fear. Around midnight, I heard a sound outside my window, a soft tapping, like fingernails against glass. My breath caught, and I sat up, my heart pounding. Slowly, I turned to look at the window, expecting to see nothing. Instead, I saw him. The boy stood outside, his face pale and his eyes sunken. He pressed his hand to the glass, leaving a faint, smudged print. "Help me," he whispered, his voice muffled. "Please, Nate." I scrambled out of bed, fumbling for the light switch. When I turned it on, the boy was gone. The window was clean, and the night was silent. But the fear stayed with me. Over the next few days, the visions grew worse. I saw the boy everywhere, in the rearview mirror of the ambulance, in the shadows of the station, even in my reflection. He didn't say anything, but his expression was always the same, desperate and pleading. Lisa noticed my change in demeanor. "You look like hell," she said one morning. "Thanks," I muttered. "You're seeing it, aren't you?" she asked, her voice softer. I nodded, too exhausted to argue. Lisa sighed. "It started. The Watchers marked you. It's only a matter of time before it tries to take you." "What do I do?" I asked, my voice cracking. Her eyes darkened. "You follow the rules. And you hope it's enough." The tension came to a head one evening when the radio crackled to life again. "Unit 2, respond to multiple injuries near the old mill. Caller reports an accident." My stomach dropped. Lisa grabbed the receiver. "We'll take it," she said, her voice steady. Then she turned to me. "You're coming with me." No arguments. We drove to the mill in silence, the fog thicker than ever. I could feel the Watcher's presence, its invisible weight pressing down on me. When we arrived, we found two men slumped near the mill's entrance, their clothes torn and bloodied. "What happened?" Lisa asked as we approached. The older of the two men looked up, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "The lights," he whispered. "They were in the trees. They followed us." As we worked to stabilize the men, I noticed something etched into the wood of the mill's walls, strange, looping symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them. "What are those?" I asked, pointing. Lisa glanced at the symbols, her face tightening. "Harker's marks," she said. "They're part of the ritual he used to summon the Watcher." The symbols seemed to pulse faintly, almost like they were alive. I couldn't look away. "It doesn't want you here," one of the men muttered, clutching my arm. "You need to leave. Now." I turned to Lisa, panic rising in my chest. "He's right. We need to get out of here." She nodded, helping the other man to his feet. But as we turned to leave, the fog seemed to thicken, the path back to the ambulance stretching impossibly far. The fog racked around us like a living thing, twisting the swamp into an unrecognizable maze. Every step back to the ambulance felt like a struggle, the mud sucking at our boots, the air growing colder and heavier. Lisa gripped the arm of one of the injured men, practically dragging him forward. I followed close behind, the other man leaning heavily on my shoulder. But the farther we walked, the more I realized something was wrong. The path back to the ambulance should have been short, 100 feet, maybe less, but it stretched on endlessly. The swamp seemed to close in around us, the trees gnarled and ancient, their branches clawing at the mist. "I don't remember this many trees," I said, my voice shaky. "Keep moving," Lisa snapped. Her flashlight flickered, the beam weak and erratic. Ahead, I saw something shift in the fog. A shadow, tall and angular, gliding silently between the trees. "Lisa," I hissed, stopping in my tracks. "I see it," she said, her voice low. "Don't stop. It's watching." The injured man at my side groaned, his legs buckling. I tightened my grip on him, my eyes darting to the shadow in the fog. It was closer now, its shape clearer, tall and spindly, its limbs impossibly long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then, from the trees above, I saw them, lights. They floated in the branches like fireflies, glowing faintly blue. At first, I thought they were just swamp gas or reflections, but as they moved, I realized they were watching us. "They followed us," the man whispered, his voice trembling. One of the lights dipped lower, hovering just above the ground. It pulsed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the mud and moss. "Don't look at it," Lisa said sharply. I tore my gaze away, focusing on the ground in front of me. But the whispers started again, soft, insistent, pulling at my mind. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single voice, deep and resonant, echoing through the swamp like a vibration in my chest. "Nate," it said. I froze. "Nate," the voice repeated, soft and insistent. "Why are you running? You've already broken the rules." It came from everywhere and nowhere, weaving through the fog like a thread. My legs felt heavy, my breath catching in my throat. "Keep moving," Lisa shouted, snapping me out of my trance. I stumbled forward, the injured man groaning as I dragged him along. But the voice didn't stop. "You can't escape, Nate. Come back to the mill. Finish what you started." The fog thickened even more, swallowing the path ahead. I could barely see Lisa's flashlight bobbing in the distance. Then, without warning, she stopped. I heard it too, a voice calling her name, soft and sweet, drifting through the mist. "Lisa," it said. "Please help me. I'm hurt." Her flashlight faltered, the beam dipping as she turned toward the sound. "No," she whispered. "No, it can't be." "Lisa, don't," I said, my voice breaking. But it was too late. She let go of the man she was supporting and stepped off the path, disappearing into the fog. "Lisa," I shouted, my voice echoing uselessly. I was alone now, the injured man slumping to the ground beside me. The other man had fallen behind, his faint groans lost in the mist. The lights in the trees pulsed brighter, the whispers growing louder. The shadowy figure moved closer, its long limbs reaching out toward me. "Nate," the voice said again. "You can't save them. But you can save yourself. Come to me." I turned, my heart racing, and ran. Somehow, I ended up back at the mill. The crumbling structure loomed over me, its walls covered in shifting symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices urging me inside. The boy was there, standing by the entrance, his face pale and tear-streaked. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "Help us." Against my better judgment, I followed him inside. The interior of the mill was even darker than I remembered, the air cold and damp. The boy led me to a large, open room at the center of the structure, its walls covered in symbols and strange markings. In the center of the room was a circle of stones, each one etched with runes that seemed to pulse faintly with light. "This is where it happened," the boy said, his voice distant. "Where what happened?" I asked, my voice echoing in the empty space. "The ritual," he said. "This is where the Watcher was summoned." As he spoke, the shadows around the room deepened, coalescing into a towering figure. The Watcher. The Watcher was enormous, its form shifting and indistinct, like a shadow made of smoke and darkness. Its eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the gloom. "You came," it said, its voice deep and resonant. "I knew you would." The boy stepped back, his expression blank. "It wants you," he said simply. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. The Watcher tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "An offering," it said. "A life. Yours, or someone else's." I backed away, my mind racing. "Why me?" I asked. "You broke the rules," the Watcher said. "You came alone. You disrespected my domain. And now, you must pay the price." The boy's voice echoed behind me. "You can save the town. But you have to finish what Harker started." The Watcher wouldn't leave me alone. Its voice followed me everywhere, soft whispers in the wind, murmurs just out of earshot, and faint reflections of its glowing eyes in the mirrors and windows around town. The boy's pale, pleading face haunted my dreams, his voice trembling as he begged me to finish what was started. Lisa's warning echoed in my mind, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't keep living like this, feeling the Watcher's pull, hearing its whispers every time I closed my eyes. That's what led me back to the Greywater Hollow archives. I told myself I was just looking for answers, but deep down, I already knew what I needed to do. The library was empty, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and old paper. Carl, the librarian, barely glanced at me as I walked to the back corner where the town records were kept. I spent hours digging through crumbling ledgers, faded photographs, and hand-scrawled notes. The deeper I went, the clearer the picture became. Jeremiah Harker's greed had doomed the mill, the town, and everyone in it. Finally, I found it, a set of yellowed pages tucked between two books. It was written in a mix of Latin and English, but the meaning was clear enough. The ritual Harker had performed wasn't meant to summon wealth or power, it was meant to bind the Watcher to the mill. But Harker hadn't completed it. The ritual required an offering, a life given willingly. My stomach twisted as I read the final line, "Without the offering, the entity will remain unbound, feeding on the living until the debt is paid." I didn't tell Lisa. She would have tried to stop me, and I couldn't let her. I needed to end this, for her, for the town, for the boy who wouldn't leave my thoughts. The ritual was simple in theory. I needed to return to the mill, step into the circle Harker had created, and offer my life to the Watcher. If I did it right, the entity would be bound again, and the town would be safe. At least for a while. The call came late that night, just as I was preparing to leave. Unit 2, respond to a possible injury near the old mill. Caller disconnected. I didn't wait for backup. I grabbed my gear and headed out, ignoring the sinking feeling in my chest as the ambulance's headlights cut through the fog. The swamp loomed ahead, its dark waters rippling faintly in the moonlight. When I arrived, the mill seemed different, larger, darker, and more menacing than before. The symbols carved into its walls glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The boy was waiting for me, standing by the entrance with his hands clasped in front of him. "You came back," he said, his voice soft and sad. "I'm here to finish it," I replied. The air inside the mill was colder than before, thick with damp and rot. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift and writhe as I passed, their edges glowing faintly blue. The boy led me to the central chamber, where the circle of stones waited. The runes etched into the stones glowed brighter as we approached, their light casting eerie shadows on the walls. "This is where it happened," the boy said. "This is where it ends." I stepped into the circle, my legs trembling. The whispers around me grew louder, merging into a chorus of voices urging me forward. The shadows in the room coalesced, pulling together into a single form. The Watcher loomed above me, its body made of shifting smoke and shadow, its eyes glowing like twin moons. "You return willingly," it said, its voice deep and resonant. "Do you accept the terms of the pact?" My throat was dry, my hands shaking. "If I do this, you leave the town alone. No more calls. No more disappearances. You stay bound to this mill." The Watcher tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "For a time, paramedic. I am eternal. Your sacrifice will delay me, nothing more." As I stood in the circle, the shadows around me shifted, forming images of my past. I saw my former partner, crumpled and lifeless on the pavement after we'd responded to the wrong call in the city. I saw the boy's face in the swamp, his eyes wide with terror. I saw Lisa, standing by the ambulance, her face twisted with grief. "You cannot escape your failures," the Watcher said. "But you can atone for them." I clenched my fists, my chest tightening. "I'll do it," I said. The runes around the circle glowed brighter as I lay down on the cold stones, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew deafening, their tones shifting from threatening to reverent, like a dark hymn. The boy stepped to the edge of the circle, his expression calm but sorrowful. "Close your eyes," he said. "It'll be over soon." I closed my eyes, the darkness pressing in around me. The air grew colder, the weight of the Watcher's presence bearing down on me. Then, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, the mill was silent. The runes around the circle had faded, their eerie glow replaced by cold, lifeless stone. The damp, rotting air of the mill felt heavier, but the oppressive presence of the Watcher was gone. I sat up slowly, my body aching. My limbs felt heavier than they should, like they didn't quite belong to me anymore. I touched my chest, expecting pain, but there was nothing, just a faint numbness that radiated outward, as if I were a ghost inhabiting my own body. The boy was gone. The shadows that had once filled the mill had receded, leaving behind an empty, desolate structure. But something about the silence felt wrong. It wasn't relief. It was waiting. I staggered to my feet and made my way outside. The swamp was unnaturally quiet. No frogs, no crickets, no wind, just the sound of my boots crunching on damp earth. The fog had lifted, revealing a cold, starless sky. The trees seemed smaller, their gnarled branches less menacing. For a moment, I thought it was over. But as I reached the ambulance, a sense of unease settled over me. My reflection in the driver's side window caught my eye, and I froze. My face was pale, almost translucent, and my eyes glowed faintly blue, the same light I'd seen in the trees. I reached out to touch the window, my fingers trembling. The reflection didn't move. It smiled. 2 days later, Lisa found me. The call had come in from the mill, an anonymous report of a body found near the swamp. Lisa, against her better judgment, responded alone. When she arrived, she didn't find a body. She found me, sitting on the steps of the mill, staring out at the water. "Nate," she called out, her voice hesitant. I turned to look at her, and the expression on her face said everything. She could see it, the change. "You shouldn't have come," I said, my voice hollow. She approached cautiously, her hand resting on the radio at her side. "What happened to you?" I tried to explain, but the words felt wrong in my mouth. "It's bound for now. The town is safe." "For now?" she repeated. I nodded. The watcher demanded a guardian. Someone to tend the mill, to keep the cycle going. "That's me now." Lisa's eyes filled with tears, but her jaw tightened. "We can get you out of this. There has to be a way." "There isn't," I said firmly. "You need to leave. The mill is dormant, but it won't stay that way forever. When the time comes, the calls will start again. And when they do..." I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "You're staying here?" she asked, her voice breaking. I nodded. "Someone has to. If I leave, the watcher will come for the town again. This is the only way." I watched Lisa leave, her figure fading into the distance as she disappeared into the trees. For the first time, I felt truly alone. The mill loomed behind me, its shadow stretching out across the swamp. The runes on its walls were faint but visible, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. I stepped back inside, my movements slow and deliberate. The air was still and cold, the silence oppressive. I could feel the watcher's presence, even if I couldn't see it. This was my life now. Months passed. The calls stopped, and the town began to recover. The fog lifted, and the swamp grew quieter. But I knew it wouldn't last. The watcher was patient, its hunger eternal. It was only a matter of time before it called again, before someone else was drawn to the mill. I wasn't the same person anymore. The glowing blue light in my eyes marked me as something other, a part of the mill's darkness. I rarely ventured into town, and when I did, the locals avoided me. The whispers still followed me, a constant reminder of the price I'd paid. One night, months after my sacrifice, I heard the sound of footsteps outside the mill. I stepped to the doorway, peering out into the dark. A young paramedic stood at the edge of the swamp, her flashlight cutting through the mist. "Hello?" she called out, her voice hesitant. I recognized her immediately, a new recruit from the station. She must have been on duty when the call came in. "Don't come any closer," I said, stepping into the light. She froze, her eyes widening as she saw me. "Nate? Is that you?" I shook my head slowly. "I'm not Nate anymore." The swamp rippled behind her, and I felt the familiar weight of the watcher's presence pressing down on me. The mill pulsed faintly, the runes on its walls flickering to life. "Leave," I said, my voice firm. "Don't ever come back here." The paramedic hesitated, then turned and ran, her flashlight bobbing wildly in the dark. As I watched her disappear into the fog, I felt the whispers grow louder, the watcher's hunger stirring once more.